It was said that it took the nation 50 years to recover from Lincoln's assassination. By that yardstick, we should have recovered from JFK's this year. But I think we all know that we haven't. Everyone remembers where they were when they heard the news of his death. I had just come out of a lecture in drama school about Stanislavski given by a Russian. When we first heard the news of the assassination, we thought it was a joke, partly because it was delivered by the school custodian, who was known frequently to be in his cups. But of course, it was not a joke. The next day, I lined up at the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square. I can still remember what I wrote in the condolence book 50 years ago. I feel this as if it were a personal tragedy. Growing up in England, I was always fascinated by America and Americans. I used to root for American athletes in the Olympic Games, and I was obsessed with wanting to be Roy Rogers. I had the full regalia of costume with 6 guns and ammunition belt. Fake ammunition, of course, unlike here. And it's a good thing it was fake, because I would probably have wreaked carnage on the country village I grew up in had it been real. At some point, I became intrigued also by American politics. They seemed so much more dynamic than ours. Undoubtedly, it began with my fear of nuclear war, a fear that hit me like a sledgehammer with the downing of the American U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union in 1960. When Nikita Khrushchev spewed his bombastic and fiery rhetoric, I realized that his threats could really precipitate the incineration of the planet. Certainly that tiny part of it occupied by England. We would have had no chance of survival at all. The geography was just too small, and the explosion of even one nuclear device would have spelled the end of our society. Then along came JFK. His charisma and articulate charm I found irresistible. I even perfected an impression of him that I performed on my father's BBC radio program when I was pressed into service because of an emergency involving one of the actors. It's true, it's on my resume. On that fateful day of November 22nd, 1963, it is wise to remember that an improvement had begun in US-Soviet relations. A nuclear test ban treaty had been signed. Communication methods between the White House and the Kremlin had been revamped to avoid the kind of miscommunication that almost did result in the incineration of the planet a year earlier in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what was not widely known was that as a result of that near-apocalyptic confrontation, JFK and Khrushchev had entered into a tacit mutual understanding, a recognition that the Cold War paradigm of mutual assured destruction was no longer acceptable. And if we ask the question, how has America changed in the last 50 years, and what would have been different had Kennedy lived? That rapprochement between those two leaders, that had it been allowed to continue, would have begun to unwind the tension that characterized their relationship, is arguably the most significant change that would have occurred. 3 days before JFK was inaugurated, President Eisenhower, in addressing the American people, said, "We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, and every office of the federal government. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwanted influence by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." Those words still have import today, more than half a century later. In his amazing book, JFK and the Unspeakable, Why He Died and Why It Matters, James W. Douglas, a Christian theologian as well as an author, talks about those back-channel conversations that ensued between Kennedy and Khrushchev following the Cuban Missile Crisis. That crisis in which both leaders had been in danger of being cowered by their respective militaries into pulling the trigger to unleash Armageddon. And both realized, having stared into the nuclear abyss, that this absurdly dangerous dynamic between the two powers had to be ended before it ended civilization. But the veil of secrecy surrounding those private communications was somehow pierced, allowing the unspeakable to set in motion the diabolical juggernaut that was to rendezvous with the assassins' high-powered rifles in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd. Yes, we would have been a very different country these past 50 years had Kennedy lived. You see, he had begun to pursue a strategy for peace that he spoke about in an address at American University in June of 1963, just 5 months before his murder. This strategy would have brought the Cold War to an end in a peaceful, cooperative way 30 years sooner than it finally did end. Vietnam would have been stopped in its tracks. We know this now because of comments he made to several people, including the Marine Corps Chief of Staff, General Shube, and to Senator Wayne Morse, a dovish critic of his, to whom he said, "Wayne, you're right. I'm getting out. Vietnam is not worth one more American life." What a waste. A waste of resources, a waste of human life, hundreds of thousands of those on the Asian subcontinent alone. Thomas Merton, Douglas writes, was a Trappist monk and the greatest spiritual writer of his generation. The unspeakable was a term coined by him after JFK's assassination and following the further assassinations of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. Merton wrote that an awful fact of our age was that the world is stricken to its very core by an evil whose depth and deceit went beyond the capacity of words to describe. The interlocking murders of John Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy were all signs of the unspeakable. Interestingly, Merton had foretold Kennedy's assassination a year earlier, in 1962. In a letter to a friend, he had actually expressed some negative criticism of JFK, feeling that he lacked substance. He said what was needed was a politician with depth and humanity and self-forgetfulness, compassion, and a deeper kind of dedication. He said, "Maybe Kennedy will break through into that someday by a miracle, but such people are before long marked out for assassination." I was working in an insurance office in Hollywood, California, the morning after Robert Kennedy's murder at the Ambassador Hotel in LA. It was the night of the California primary in 1968 when he was killed, and I had spent the night in front of the TV hoping for the recovery from the assassin's bullet that never came. The next morning, while at work, a businessman from the office next door came in with a big grin on his face. He was happy. "Well, we got him, didn't we?" he said. There it was, the unspeakable with a human face. When I emigrated to the United States and with my wife, Karen, settled in her native state of California, it was less than 3 years after the assassination. I wanted desperately to believe in the essential goodness of America, and I just drew a curtain over the events of November 22nd. But the sense that something had changed irreversibly gnawed at me. I tried with good success to immerse myself in the Southern California consumerist culture and to enjoy the good life. But I really wished I could have turned the clock back to those halcyon days I had viewed from 6,000 miles away, when the young president exuded confidence and the nation was filled with a sense of hope and optimism. In the mid-60s, there was little optimism. Rather, a pall of incipient despair hung over the country. It was a foretelling of the malaise that Jimmy Carter alluded to 12 years later, and for which he was pilloried. How dare anyone imply that anything less than unbridled optimism defines the United States? The comedian and satirist Mort Sahl had a radio show in LA when we arrived. There was only one talk radio station in those days, and unlike today, it represented a variety of viewpoints. Mort was no longer the good-natured, hip comedian who had performed at the Hungry Eye in San Francisco some years earlier. He was mad. His mood was dark. The country is coming apart, he would say. He was mad about Vietnam and its inexorably increasing body count that went up week after week, 100, 125, 150, finally 500 American deaths a week. And he was mad about the cover-up of the truth behind the assassination. His conscience wouldn't allow him to say, life goes on, we've grieved over Kennedy's death, now let's put it behind us. And he was mad at the Hollywood liberal elitists whose way of honoring Kennedy was to attack those searching for the truth. He reminded us night after night that the President of the United States had his head blown off in the streets of Texas in broad daylight. His skull fragments were on the rear deck of the limousine, his brain tissue on Jackie Kennedy's pink suit. This unthinkable, unspeakable act took place in our lifetime, not 100 years ago. And Mort Sahl realized that when those shots rang out in Dealey Plaza, that nothing would ever be the same again until the forces of evil, the unspeakable, were unmasked. You see, they didn't even have the decency to kill him under cover of darkness. They didn't slip poison into his coffee or infiltrate his inner circle in cloak and dagger fashion. No. They wanted the world to see what happens when a leader has the courage, a profiling courage perhaps, to challenge the entrenched powers. They wanted to demonstrate that in the contest between war and peace, that the war machine is indefatigable and will not surrender to anybody, not even the president, especially not the president. Imagine the confluence of powerful forces necessary to concoct such a plot and get away with it. To know that you have the power to, with impunity, blow away the President of the United States in full view of thousands of onlookers. The powerful evil that represents is indeed unspeakable. To desecrate and defecate on the hopes, the ideals of all of us, of all the children who are taught to admire our system of government. And its legacy is an obscene stain on that government that the passage of time cannot remove. You know, Mort Sahl went to the National Archives in Washington to look at the Zapruder film, the only place it was then available. This was before YouTube. And the Zapruder film, a home movie for those of you too young to remember, was the only film that shows the assassination from beginning to end. Frame 313 shows the final deadly shot. Its force drives Kennedy back in his seat as his head explodes. And Mort Sahl said, it is the force of a train hitting him from the front. I'd recommend that those of you who are too young to have experienced the events of November 22nd go to YouTube and search for the Zapruder film and watch it, because you need to see what happened to our president within the lifetime of many of us gathered here. Kennedy's assassination was followed in short order by the murders of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. I didn't know until I read this book that there was a trial held in connection with Martin Luther King's murder. It was a wrongful death suit filed by the King family in 1999. James Douglas was the only person to attend every day of that trial. He writes that 70 witnesses testified over a 6-week period. They described a sophisticated government plot involving the FBI, the CIA, the Memphis police, mafia intermediaries, and an Army Special Forces sniper team. 12 jurors, 6 black and 6 white, deliberated for 2.5 hours. They came back with a verdict that King had been assassinated by a conspiracy involving agencies of his own government. As Vietnam was aflame, America was also burning, literally. In LA, in Detroit, in New York, and in other cities, rioting became commonplace. The Vietnam War lasted another 12 years. 60,000 American lives and countless more Asian lives were lost. For what? 4 students at Kent State University were shot dead demonstrating against the war. And America's still at war. We've never stopped being at war. There's been some kind of conflict since the end of World War II, if you think about it. Iraq's went on longer than Vietnam. Every president and almost every legislator has cast their lot in support of that military-industrial complex that a general and Republican president warned us about 52 years ago. "52 years ago. 1961 is when he made that speech. Kennedy had faced death on several occasions. In World War II in the Pacific, when fighting numerous serious illnesses, and in coping with the death of his older brother and sister. In addition, he endured excruciating back pain as a result of his injuries in the Pacific. He didn't shrink from death, he almost welcomed it as if he knew it was coming. He had a favorite poem, Rendezvous. It was written by a World War I poet and soldier who subsequently died in combat. And in his book, Douglas describes the most haunting rendition of this poem. You see, Jackie, knowing that it was Jack's favorite, had taught it to their daughter Caroline, and she knew it by heart. And one day in 1963, the 5-year-old Caroline interrupted her father as he was conducting a National Security Council meeting in the Rose Garden. She tried to get his attention, tugging on his sleeve. He tried to ignore her. Finally, he relented and gave in and turned to her. And then she, looking into his eyes, recited Rendezvous. I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. When spring comes back with rustling shade and apple blossoms fill the air, I have a rendezvous with death when spring brings back blue days and fair. It may be he shall take my hand and lead me into his dark land and close my eyes and quench my breath. It may be I shall pass him still. I have a rendezvous with death. On some scarred slope of battered hill, when spring comes round again this year, and the first meadow flowers appear. God knows 'twere better to be deep pillowed in silk and scented down, where love throbs out in blissful sleep, pulse nigh to pulse and breath to breath, where hushed awakenings are dear. But I've a rendezvous with death, at midnight in some flaming town, when spring trips north again this year, and I to my pledged word am true. I shall not fail that rendezvous.